Work at We Are What We Do, he has tried to take this a step further, drawing on behavioral economics and social psychology to create projects that incidentally affect people's behaviors in positive ways. Over the last 5 years, Nick's team has launched a string of creative behavior change products and tools, including the I Am Not a Plastic Bag Shopper, Teacher Granny to Text Children's Book, and the digital tools, Internet Buttons, and Historypin, which is the project we'll be discussing today. Nick has been included in Britain's New Radicalist in 2012, and his team has won a number of awards for their projects, including a Webby in 2012 for Best Nonprofit Project with Historypin. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hi, everybody. First of all, apologies for this slightly rushed late beginning. The subway system, despite its air conditioning, let me down today, so I got a little bit stuck. But it's really nice to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation and for setting it all up. I've got a kind of 10-day trip in my favourite city in the world, going around talking to lots of interesting people, and really glad to be here this morning. So I'm going to talk a bit about the roots and origins of Historypin, and then give you a little bit of a demo of how each bit of the kind of project works as it stands and how the kind of the world of Historypin fits together, and then talk a bit about what we're going to be doing over the next 12 months and how the project's developed in its kind of core purpose and the function that the community has really defined for it. So as Robbie says, the organisation behind Historypin, which I run, is called We Are What We... Oops, sorry, hold on a minute. Is called We Are What We Do as a not-for-profit behaviour change company. I won't speak very much about We Are What We Do, but to give you the kind of the rationale for Historypin, we work as an organisation on a series of different social and environmental issues. Those issues are always things that are very damaging for quality of life, very expensive for the government to deal with, and very consequential for communities and for society as a whole. And our second kind of reason for being around these issues is that they are all things that are defined by and sustained by people's everyday behaviours. So these are some of the issues that we're looking at the moment: food waste, obesity, and the issue that kind of we worked hard on understanding better when we were putting Historypin together was the intergenerational divide. So we did around 18 months worth of research and development around the nature and extent of the gap between older and younger people. So lots of people might have created Historypin from a kind of cultural heritage perspective. It could have come into being from an academic perspective. It could have come into being from an institution and kind of access to collections perspective. And it does do all of these things, but for us, the motivations were that it was a behavior change tool to bring older and younger generations together in compelling, mutually interesting ways. The starting points being that gap is bigger and more damaging than it's ever been. And the traditional approach to intergenerationality tends to be that kind of awkward high school disco project with the seniors in one corner and the young people in the other corner. And you have to go pick your senior and have an awkward conversation over a cup of tea. When actually the exchange of culture and history and identity and values across generation is extraordinarily valuable for society and for those individuals. It's just two separate worlds have kind of developed within modern society. And something like the stories behind and the narrative and the memory behind old images and videos and audio clips are a powerful, mutually compelling way of bringing generations together. So alongside that work we were doing as an organisation, there's also some things that happened in my life which kind of started to develop some of the ideas around Historypin. This is my gran on the right-hand side here, and my great auntie Jenny, and this is August 14th, 1943, in a little village in Leicestershire when they were working as land girls. And before my gran died a few years ago, we spent a lot of time together around old photos and stories. And it was quite a big farming family, and my granddad died before I was born, so it was quite matriarchal, and the relationship with my gran was always quite kind of formal, perhaps. But our time together around these photographs completely transformed that relationship. And obviously maybe wish I'd done it a lot sooner and a lot more often. But essentially, it brought home to me in a way that hadn't been before the power of coming together around cultural heritage materials to share stories and compare lives and to show that the difference between older and younger generations is not all that it necessarily is made out to be. And this photo in particular she loved, because just after it was taken, 4 American GIs drove down the road behind this field, and I was so caught by my grand's probably very short skirt for 1940s that they crashed into the ditch. And they had to be looked after by my gran and the family she was working for over the next few weeks. So she really liked the idea that she was kind of eye-catchingly pretty in her heyday, and told the story a lot in her final days. So this didn't, obviously one route for that, from that story is kind of genealogical, and that area, that kind of sphere is well catered for. And there, obviously, if I'd wanted to create a family tree out of all of this, then I could have gone to 10 places to do it. But it didn't actually lead me towards a genealogical process. It led me to want to find out much more about this time and this place, what the context was, what world she lived in. And that's not really what genealogy kind of leads you towards. So what I did next was to go out into the village and to have lots and lots of conversations with people, particularly about the 1930s and 1940s, but more broadly as well, and to try and create a little map of life as it was in the 30s and 40s in that particular village. This is a smattering of some of the content that's collected. I had hundreds of conversations with people, and most of those conversations generated a bit of content and a story, and it also developed a relationship. So without kind of really realizing it, I was doing two things. I was creating a local archive for the village, which happens all over the world. People go through this process a lot. And I was also generating links and connections and fostering social capital within that community. And I managed to find a whole load of really interesting things. This was the road that those GIs drove down. This was just before the war, when it was a road that could still be walked on and parked on. You can't see it very well in this light, but that's the hunt. I don't know if you know about the hunt, but basically we're not allowed to do it anymore, which is a good thing. But with posh people on horses chasing around foxes and then setting their dogs on them. But this is what they were doing in the early 1930s on this road. 10 years before this, in the very early 1930s, a lady sitting next to that road, which I heard lots of interesting stories about people used to do along that road. A couple in the village that ran a hotel, which no longer exists, and then finding out, the kind of the rooms within that hotel and the stories and the kind of things that went on, and just kind of uncovering bit by bit the story of this particular bit of the world at this particular time. Even managed to find some old video footage from the early 1960s of people driving down this road, one of the earliest bits of camcorder footage, and hardly any cars on it. So what all of this, as I said, did was start to show the local power of this communal storytelling and memory gathering experience. It was a really lovely thing to do with that community, and I got to know them very well. They got to know me, and they got to know each other better. We're at a time now when we don't really know our neighbours, and so alongside the intergenerational gap, we were also looking at the way that people could come together with people who they live near, which is a kind of increasingly and oddly rare these days. So we then put together the research we've been doing on intergenerationality, put together the experiences that I had had and we had had, and started to develop some ideas for how there was an activity which communities could do together, which happens sporadically and occasionally in different communities around the world, but essentially, how could we make it a ubiquitous activity? How could we kind of perhaps make this activity easier to do and make it more relevant and more mainstream, aggregate it into something bigger, join it up and make connections between all of this work, and make it a little bit more permanent and self-perpetuating. So we had, and it's really important in all of our work, to recognize that there are lots of behaviors that we want to kind of inculcate within the mainstream, but they are, when we start, they're normally associated with a particular group of people. So the environment's a perfect example of that. In any community, there's a kind of eco-warrior people, and that tends to infect those behaviors to make them not particularly relevant for the wider community. And particularly in within mainstream culture, lots of those things we do, doing good and doing green, are things that the 1% club do. And around something like local archiving, this kind of activity and coming together around photos and talking about times of the war is something that is not appealing to young people as a kind of as a day-to-day activity. So that was our main challenge. We recognized that as our main challenge to begin with. And we designed something from the very top called the 16-year-old boy test. And the idea of the 16-year-old boy test was that you would stick an old photo up in the wall in front of a classroom of 16-year-old boys, and they would shrug their shoulders and want to do something else. But if you started injecting technology and creativity and communications into this content and made it feel more relevant and exciting, then you could therefore kind of create new associations with the behaviors around that content. It would drive them to go out and find it and talk to their grandparents about it. So we tried two concepts. One was the first idea, which was to do with scale and to do with replicability, and obviously that 16-year-old boy test, was that the map didn't actually look like this. The map looked like this, which was, for every location, there was also a date. So this idea of fourth dimensional mapping started to emerge with the idea that you could split a map into a whole series of temporal layers. Each layer is just a decade here. But obviously, as the archive got denser, it could be split up again and again and again. And so that was the first concept we explored, which also shows how you could gather thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of content in one location, because you could just carry on splitting it via those layers of time and allow people to explore particular dates and particular locations. And what this did was, we had a concept early on, which we were kind of fascinated by, about the idea of every spot on the planet having this vast column of history extending from, well, beneath it or in front of it, or however you see time. And the idea of being able to go to that spot and then immerse yourself within those layers kind of fascinated us, and this concept of fourth dimensional mapping meant that we could sell that idea to more people. So that was one part of the big part of the approach. The other part was this idea of overlaying old images onto their modern backdrops, which immediately injects loads of life and relevance into the content. And lots of people have been doing it really nicely. When we first started testing it, there was one guy in particular called Jason Powell who was holding up old photos in front of backdrops, which has now been kind of famously taken up by the guy doing Dear Photograph. And there's lots of other really nice projects where people hold up old photographs over old backgrounds. And essentially what this did when it came to something like the 16-year-old boy test was take a piece of content that wasn't relevant and overlay it onto a piece of content that was relevant and show that the two had a relationship. And it suddenly injected loads of life and relevance for these younger audiences. And it was a really compelling way. Yeah, you wouldn't be able to do that now. It was a really compelling way of injecting lots of kind of creativity and relevance into cultural heritage content. So as well as the technical and creative development, we also put together a set of very strong social objectives. The project's non-profit. We will never commercialize the project in a kind of traditional sense. There'll never be paywalls. There'll never be advertising. Because the first point is particularly important to us: the widest possible access to the exploration and enjoyment of historical content. A broad aim of the project that we believed that by allowing people to interact with content in these ways and add to it and contribute, that it could do all the things we wanted it to around behavior change. Secondly, to generate and multiply social capital in neighborhoods. As I described, that process of coming together around a collective local memory is a powerful one and generates lots of those associations and local trust networks. Fostering sustained positive intergenerational context and understanding. Obviously, that was a very early one. Provided effective teaching, learning, research tools and opportunities. That's starting kind of 9 months into the project. That's really starting to come through, that use of the tool within schools and within academic settings, which we'll talk more about at the end, I'm sure. And then finally, provision and care of support for older people. That one it was important to us to have that one in from the beginning, because we wanted to play a big role in what is becoming a defining issue for our societies, particularly the UK and the US, but all over the world, which is the aging of the population and the incredible increase in dementia rates, and the clever use of things like reminiscence therapy and memory clinics, and the role that we could play within that setting. In the UK, for example, there are 18,000 care homes, residential homes, whatever the equivalent here is, and that number will need to double within 30 years. And so it's something that I'm kind of alongside youth obesity. It's the two most expensive parts of the NHS budget, and I should imagine here two extraordinary costs as well. So we put together our core social objectives, and they definitely remain at the heart of the project and always will do. And then we, with all the testing we've been doing, with the results of the 16-year-old boy test, we put together our digital tools, which we beta tested between mid-2010 and mid-2011, and launched just over the park in the Museum in the City of New York in July last year. We've had during that time, I mean, I'll come back to some of the challenges of the project, but the site, as I'll kind of walk through in a minute, and the app have both done very well, and they're growing quickly, and they've won awards, and we've got a great audience, and that's growing. But we're competing, on the one hand, in a world that moves relatively slowly. I say competing, I don't really mean competing, I mean kind of operating within a world, because our approach is definitely not trying to compete, really. It's obviously trying to find a place for Historypin, but it's about trying to add value and through our approach to add value to other people's work. So within the kind of academic world, in the institutional world and archive world, we're moving very quickly, and we've had enormous support and growth within that area. Within the kind of tech world, where these projects have enormous tech development budgets, we kind of have to scramble a bit more to keep up. So these tools are good, but probably a year on, we've had to work much harder than we thought to update them kind of every month. And to find the budgets to do that has been quite challenging. But we'll talk a bit more about how the project's sustained at the end. But essentially, the tools are based around a giant map onto which you can add images, video content, and audio content, and then attach to those pieces of content recollections and stories. And then that allows people to come back and to pick a particular location and a particular date and to explore that. And as the archive builds, as the project builds, obviously this experience becomes more and more immersive. So yes, so you find yourself a piece of content. Here I don't think you'll see, people, the first person can add a bit of story content, and then lots of other people can add further narrative to that story content. You've got the basic data attached to it, and then a more sophisticated data, particularly relevant for archives, libraries, museums. And then if that image is taken externally, then it can be overlaid onto Street View and allow this really lovely window into history, which again, when we went back to the 16-year-old boy test, after we developed the tools, this was scoring really, really highly. Because it suddenly allows you to walk around your neighborhood in a whole different way and open up these windows into history and often show, sometimes show that things look very different, but also show kind of in lots of ways that life kind of, sometimes look similar, sometimes look different, but it ultimately feel closer to history than you would. This idea of making comparisons between then and now is a core visual element of the project. And obviously here, Street View is one way of doing that, but because Street View doesn't go everywhere, well, not yet anyway, what the new smartphone app allows you to do is take something called Historypin Repeats, which is allowing you to take a modern replica of old pictures. So this is John Voss, our San Francisco lead. This is his grandfather by the Jefferson Memorial in 1950, and he went and stood next to his grandfather and snapped the Historypin Repeat, allowing that comparison to be made. So that allows that idea of kind of modern historic visual comparisons to be taken everywhere, inside, outside, public spaces, private spaces. So as I said, as well as image content, it also at the moment is video and audio content. That's kind of gradually evolving, and there's more documents and maps and all sorts of things coming on. This little man in Italy, I shouldn't think that he would have been spoken about all over the world, but he has done. Again, it starts to show that with lots of very rich, diverse pieces of content, you can genuinely immerse yourself in a moment through these tools and through this technology. And then audio content, which is proving really popular. I don't think we're going to be able to hear this fantastically well. But what audio content's done is which has probably grown much quicker than we thought, is allow people to recreate kind of events and concerts in a really compelling way. So this is Neville Chamberlain's announcement at the beginning of the Second World War. And people have done things like recreate famous concerts and with images and audio files and videos and that kind of thing. So that's the core site tools as they stand. There are lots of other features which I'll walk through in a little bit. The smartphone application, this is actually the upgrade that comes out next week. But the kind of core experience of that is still this idea of wandering around a map and finding content near to you, and then pulling up that content and reading stories, and then using your camera view to be able to wander around and see images near you. So this is what happens if you hold up the camera view outside our office in London. You see there's a whole load of images near you, and then you find one that's close by. So this one's 177 meters away. It's Smithfield Market. You walk down Smithfield Market, and then you can then overlay the old image on top of the new image, which yesterday I did all the way down there. This is a really wonderful collection of content on the other side of the park, of a whole series of old buildings on Fifth. And it's a really kind of magic experience when the collections are really rich like that. This is just outside St Paul's. It's a little bit dark, you can't see it particularly well, but just showing how, and actually St Paul's is a bad example in some ways because it looks exactly the same as it did 80 years ago. But you can overlay a black and white image of the same view. But there are people and things going on in that picture. But essentially, I mean, again, this has proved really, the app has grown particularly quickly. It's got about 550,000 downloads, and will, I think, become an increasing way for people to digitize content of their own collections as well. So people taking a picture of an old picture rather than going through a kind of formal scanning process is becoming more and more prevalent as well. So in terms of people exploring and adding content, the app is a particularly important part of the project. And then what we do, which again is what I did down Fifth Avenue yesterday, is we invite people to take a modern replica of that old picture, which again does two really nice things for the system. One, it gives the system another comparison to make, and it also gives you an exact bit of geolocation data relating to the footprint of the original photographer, if the person today stood in the same place. So yeah, the site and the app are the core digital tools. And then the world of Historypin, in terms of how we approach the project and how we develop it, is divided at the moment into three main areas. Because of relationships like this, and because of a relationship that we've just about to kick off formally with Stanford in California and with King's College in London, universities and higher education will become a kind of fourth pillar of this. But at the moment, we divide up our audiences into citizen historians, which is what we call our everyday users. And there's about 55,000 registered users on Historypin and about, as I said, over 500,000 app download users. Libraries, archives, and museums. There's around 350 contributing around the world. That's probably one area that's grown particularly quickly. I think lots of libraries, archives, museums were waiting for a project that was non-commercial and that didn't take any copyright and that had the kind of aims and ambitions that we've had. And so that audience has grown really, really fast. And probably about 60% of those are in the US, about 30% in the UK, and then about 10% in around the world. Maybe more like 20% around the rest of the world. Australia's grown very quickly in that sense as well. And then local community work. I think probably, which I'll talk a bit more about, the project is at its best when it's trying to, I mean, because of our roots, we're able to recognize that lots of the things that Silicon Valley does around content like this will always miss what goes on in local communities around cultural heritage. And that most of our metadata crowdsourcing, which is what kind of our new set of tools is all about, which is the idea of finding the dates and the locations and the tags attached to particular pieces of content. Most of that is offline and sitting around tables with groups of people with cups of tea and pieces of paper. And the tools come into it, so there could be one person around that table who then gets all that metadata onto the system. But most of the metadata crowdsourcing, despite how technical it sounds, is just about conversations with people in communities. And so that overlap between online and offline presence is particular. If there's a Venn diagram, of online and offline local archiving and communal storytelling. We definitely see ourselves in that bit in the middle. So citizen historians, I mean, essentially the core tools of the project are designed to appeal to a mainstream audience. And they divide up for us into 6 areas. So obviously the main map, which we've had a look at, the street view overlays, the storytelling, and you know, this idea of if you don't have content to necessarily pin, people are always going to have memories and recollections. So that communal storytelling, again, is growing really nicely around, you know, particular areas of content in particular. Collections, which is where content can be, there is a particular favourite theme running through our office at the moment. Collections, which allows content to be grouped together, and then tours, which allow content to be strung together into a narrative, strung together in a particular order. Tours has probably proved the most popular part of kind of means of curation of content. This idea of, actually particularly environments like schools, and obviously people who do walking tours and things, people being able to kind of piece together a whole series of pins into a journey and then allow people to explore that journey either online or with the app. It's a kind of free tour maker that is proving really popular and really effective. And then the Historypin Repeat, which I said has just been launched, which is this really nice way of kind of adding further comparisons between old images and their modern comparisons. And those core tools in relation to that mainstream audience will continue to grow, and they'll always be very, very simple. And ideally eye-catching, and based on that idea that 99% of this audience are just going to come and look, and 1% of the audience are going to contribute and add something, which is fairly standard. We're at about 2.5% now, but as the audience grows, it'll tend to go down to that kind of 1% rule, which is fairly standard for projects like this. For libraries, archives, and museums, the tools get a little bit more sophisticated. One of the main pieces of new development we've had for this audience has been our channels, which everyone can use, but essentially it's a section of the site which can be defined and skinned purely for that particular institution. So it can be branded and designed. It just shows their content, and essentially, and also shows any stories that have been added to that content and any repeats that have been done in relation to that content. So what a channel does is essentially give an institution their own space, their own home on Historypin, which can then be curated. Obviously, all the content will go on the main map as well, but this is a kind of a space that allows them to kind of show off their collections in isolation. And it's proved really, really popular. We only launched it about 8 weeks ago, and all these, and you know, there's about 50% of all users took them up very quickly and started designing them, and the rest are coming on slowly. So, and the channels also, the channels essentially is based around this main central panel. This is the Imperial War Museum's channel, which allows replicates all the same content as on the main Historypin map, but just in relation to that user's content. So the Imperial War Museum, for example, obviously they like seeing their content mixed up with everyone else's, but they've particularly been drawn to this idea of showing what is really kind of very striking content in isolation on the map, and they can control that environment as much as they need to. And then also, stories in relation to those content can be looked at. So within this one, a particular event, anti-Vietnam protest in 1968 in Grosvenor Square in London. A whole series of people have added more stories to that. And then also in this particular archive, it's been quite popular for repeats. So they can go and see who's gone and taken some modern replicas of their old pictures. So yeah, the channel's functionality is particularly aimed at the archival community. And one of the things that goes along with that is embeds. So this is someone that has, oh, skip to the end a second, sorry. So this is a bath in time. And they've embedded Historypin on their own website. So essentially what the channel allows you to do is grab code, take that code and stick it on your own website, and then basically have Historypin tools on your site, which has proved really popular, more popular than we thought. It's very simple the way it works, and it basically allows people to have mapping tools on their site that they never would have been able to invest in themselves. And it all runs from the channel, so all the content that's on the institution's channel then flows onto this. Yeah, I mean, because all the maintenance and all the moderation is done on Historypin, it gives a kind of very simple, quick upgrade of tools to a whole series of institutions. This is a relatively small local archive in the UK. They never would have been able to afford these kind of tools, and now they can have them on their own site, which has proved a real boost for lots of institutions. And it also shows their collections and any tools that they've made. And then what goes along with these new tools is the bulk uploader. So this is the Powerhouse Museums channel in Australia. They've designed it all up, and this is showing them using the bulk uploader tool, which allows, so previously each piece of content would be added one by one. This allows a whole batch of files to be added alongside a CSV file, a spreadsheet with all of the metadata related to that. You'll see down the left-hand side there's a unique identifier for each of those pieces of content. The CSV files dropped in, all the files are dropped in, and around 1,000, I think, at once can be added. That'll grow, but it's essentially a very simple way of adding lots of content. At the moment, we don't have APIs to allow this to become automated as such, but it's suiting institutions to be able to generate a CSV file from their own database, and then grab a whole load of content, and then put the two together on Historypin, and they integrate, and then they all become mapped according to the metadata. If there is no location or date information within the spreadsheets, then that content appears on the channel, but doesn't appear on the main map. So it'll appear in the list view. And then institutions can go back through and add date or location or other information as they find out more about it. And then they can pull back down an updated spreadsheet from our system to update their own systems with. It'll gradually become more sophisticated and more automated. I think one of our bit of reluctance at the moment is that lots of institutions and archives, libraries, museums, universities have very different systems. There's around 40 systems that are used. And we want to have the kind of lowest bar for participation at the moment. We will allow kind of more and more API and more integration to happen automatically. So yeah, the bulk uploader tool has really, the number of, within kind of 9 weeks, the content doubled pretty quickly on the back of this, partly because the channels was such a big incentive for institutions to get onto Historypin, and partly because the bulk uploader allowed lots more to be shared. Roughly, there's around kind of 150,000 pieces of content on there. Around 50% of that is from archives, libraries, museums, and around 50% of that is from everyday users, which is exactly the kind of balance that we were looking to get, that interaction between formal collections and informal collections, or personal, I mean public and private collections, is a really big part of the project. And then all of these tools are complemented by a Historypin in Residence program, which is where we get people out spending time from our team within different institutions. We're aiming to have someone on the ground in New York to be able to spend time with lots of different institutions fairly soon, hopefully. It really helps move things forward, and particularly because we're such a young project and people are just getting to know us, that face-to-face time makes a big difference when it comes to developing ways to collaborate. And then there's also access to a whole series of help desk tools and facilities and all that kind of stuff. So that is where the project stands at the moment in relation to libraries, archives, museums. And obviously these three sections overlap in lots and lots of ways. And I think as I said, this area of the project around local communities, one motivation of institutions or libraries, archives, museums participating is obviously to share their content in interesting ways, to open it up to the public, to increase access, to allow people to contribute to it. But another way is as a means of local community engagement. So what we'd love to be doing in New York over the next year is to be designing a whole series of projects across New York around particular collections or particular ambitions. And I'll speak a bit more about how we design those projects. But essentially that allows this activity to happen. And as I described at the beginning, that process of natural, mutually compelling intergenerational storytelling is a big, big part of the project and flows out naturally from the process of trying to gather and pin content. And the way that that can then feed exhibitions and community activities. It's a natural force for digital inclusion. I don't actually know what the digital exclusion numbers here are. In the UK, there's about 8 million people that aren't online, and around 20 more million people that use the internet so irregularly that they don't really count as being online. And those rates are relatively low. I'm sure it's higher here. But that is creating a kind of an even bigger intergenerational divide and an intercultural and kind of socioeconomic divide as well. So, and a lot of the reasons for that are a kind of refuse-nick culture that the internet isn't for me, because it's kind of, passed you by. And Historypin is hopefully a way of undermining a bit of that reticence to get involved with the internet, within communities particularly. A means of training and skills. I mean, this is basically for us what a metadata crowdsourcing session looks like, which is just people coming together and often learning new skills and certainly getting new relationships. And then within schools, the idea of it being a teaching tool and a community engagement tool for schools is schools are such a powerful hub of these activities. They've got all the remit, all the facilities, all the incentives to get out into their communities or invite people into their schools and start gathering and enriching local archives, local heritage. So those are the 3 areas of the project as it stands, and I'm just holding for time. Doing right. Before I go into 2012 and 2013 plans, has there anybody got anything they wanted to ask about the kind of project as it stands? Yes.
I know on Flickr there's several institutions that have large
yes.
historical, Library of Congress, National Library of Ireland.
Mm.
Is Historypin mining them, or are you collaborating with those institutions to create their channels?
Sure. So Flickr API is a really important next step, and there's one in development, so that once people have got their stuff onto Flickr, they can go straight onto Historypin. And it's fairly easy. If they've done that Flickr sharing work, and lots of, so the US National Archives is a good example, and lots of others. They've done that work, and they're starting to use Historypin and getting content to there. It makes it relatively easy. The one bit that obviously our system needs that Flickr doesn't is a bit more metadata around date and location. So often it's a question of identifying things that have been shared that have got that metadata, and they can be just drawn not straight over, but essentially the files and the data is in shape to be able to migrate it. We love Flickr as a great inspiration to us, and we want to make it as easy as possible for people to participate in as many projects as possible. Yes. Yes. Well, only because, to begin with, so there's a simple answer and a longer answer, but the simple answer is that's when photography began, and the site is currently made up of images, video, and audio. We're very close to extending that, which we'll do probably over the next few weeks, because there's more types of content coming onto the site that are relevant to the before that. One of the reasons why we started off with recorded content is because we wanted to create a line between subjective and objective, and that a pin would represent recorded history that you couldn't just make up. And you could add subjective things to that, so people could interpret and kind of gather narrative around those recordings. But essentially, I just couldn't stick on a pin on the map saying this happened here. Obviously, photography and those recordings are subjective in their own right, and certainly in terms of what isn't recorded is enormously subjective. But it felt like it was with lots of other different kinds of documents, it was slightly more of a grey area. But we're taking that grey area on now, and then in terms of there being documents and illustrations and maps and a whole series of different materials that run before 1840, they all start to come onto the project fairly quickly. So. Yes?
When you say we, how large is the staff working on this?
Yes. So there's about 16 of us, across the whole of We Are What We Do, the kind of parent organisation, there's about 20 of us in London and San Francisco and Sydney, most of them in London, and then 5 on top of that, developers in Sofia in Bulgaria. And then probably about half of that team are working on Historypin. So there's probably about 12 people around the world working full-time on Historypin, and then a network of lots of partners and people. And that's made up of digital, creative, communications, a content management team. And then in terms of funding, there really is a long answer to that one, but I will do the short version, which is that we are partly funded by, we're kind of funded in a fairly traditional way and then in an entrepreneurial way. So the traditional way is grants from foundations and trusts, and particularly with such strong social objectives and such kind of strong educational work, we do get quite a good flow of grants and support from foundations and trusts. And that probably constitutes about kind of between 50 and 60% of the funding. And then on the kind of service and product side, on the platform itself, as I said, we won't charge for app downloads, we won't charge for access, won't use advertising, mainly because the content isn't ours and we recognize that and we don't want to monetize the content. But the tools are ours, and we can monetize those in separate environments. So, for example, we've just signed a deal with a big TV station here to embed our tools in their back end to be their kind of user-generated content system. Which was totally separate from Historypin, and we're allowed to kind of take a margin from that and reinvest it in the project. And then we will also do things like, there's already been a demand for more and more of the kind of services we provide to add value to all of this. So special interface design for particular projects or partnerships. The Historypin in Residence stuff is kind of funded. And we may also consider, depending on how the community feel about it, things like a kind of channel plus feature or something like that. So you have a standard channel, and then if you want a whole load of customization features, as an institution, you pay a subscription or something like that. But the idea is to keep the commercial bits as far away as possible from the mainstream experience, so that it doesn't infect it in any way. But it's an ongoing challenge. And as I said, the hardest bit is that we really need $500,000 a year of digital development. That's what we should be spending. We're spending about a third of that at the moment. Which is where Bulgaria comes in handy. To get that bit is most hard, because the grants and the trust foundations find it hardest to fund a digital development team. They love funding the community engagement, the educational work, and the kind of cultural heritage work specifically. So, but yeah, it's an ongoing puzzle that we're working out as we go, and it's a bit of an experiment as to how you run something like this without commercializing it. Which we never will, but it's for it to meet the aims that we want it and ambitions we want it to reach, it's going to need a huge amount of money, and how to get that is an ongoing puzzle. Anything else before I move on? Yes. What about donations? Yeah, so we're just in the US setting up ourselves as a 501c3. To be able to accept donations. That's already in place in the UK, so in the UK we do accept some. And I think there's probably some interesting ways of doing that. There's the basic, if you like Historypin, help us out. And then there's perhaps donations in relation to particular projects or collections. So if you want to support us going into this community or working with this institution, or support us doing that. And as I'll talk about with the projects model, as Historypin divides up into a series of tasks, so the idea of contributing to a huge map through time is nice but difficult, whereas specific tasks, as I'll explain in more detail, it is much more manageable, and those tasks could be kind of crowd-funded, I think, as well. Okay, so in 2012 and 2013, we've got two main pieces of development going on. One is around metadata crowdsourcing tools, which is something we're specifically working with Stanford on, but we'll collaborate with a whole series of different organizations. But the spatial history lab over there has been doing all sorts of really interesting data-related mapping stuff, and that's overlapped a lot with our work. So we've been doing some joint applications for tool development. So essentially where this starts is that this is a test interface at the moment, but this image, for example, boring as it looks, it is full of mysteries. So we know it was somewhere on Upminster High Street, and we know it was somewhere in the 1960s. But apart from that, there are, the specific location, the specific date, who's getting out of the car, what car is it, what all the shops are, anything else that helps explain the context of this image. So there are probably 10 mysteries around this that could be solved. And that data doesn't exist in relation to that piece of content, and therefore these tools will invite people to collaborate to solve all those mysteries, which will be, we've started doing lots of paper testing of this, which is basically getting people round and trying to solve those mysteries together, or running Google Hangouts across the world and getting people to solve those mysteries. In terms of the conversations and the community kind of cohesion that we want to generate, it's just as valuable, if not more valuable, than the actual hunt for content in the first place. So that's the first bit. Let's get this stuff out and digitized and onto Historypin. The second bit of trying to complete our understanding of that is another whole series of conversations and pieces of collaboration. So as I said, this is one of the test interfaces we're working on. On the right-hand side, you'll see that in this case, we're testing location, date, street view, position, and caption as areas that could be edited and agreed upon, and then a whole series of tags. In latter versions, we're also testing spatial tags, which is where particular bits of the content is tagged. Also with video, we're testing dynamic spatial tags, which is where the pin can essentially follow the footage through place and time, so you can show how it moves through. And the idea being that people make an edit on one of those areas, they justify that edit, and then the way we'll build the system to begin with is the content owner will be able to sign off that edit. So they'll be able to say, yes, I agree that this photo was in 1962, tick. And then someone else will say, actually, I think it was the 12th of August, 1962, and then there's a debate, and then the owner will tick that. And gradually, the data will get more and more accurate. It's complicated. It's already proving very complicated because some of the things are easy to agree. So around something like a street view overlay, it's obvious when it's right. Around lots of other pieces of metadata, it may never be obvious exactly what's right, and it may be impossible to find the right answer. So what the crowd can agree upon via this kind of process is an interesting thing to test and develop. But that technical development is a very big part of our work over the next 12 months, and the idea being that people can arrive with collections which they know very little about. They can put those into an interface and allow the crowd to get stuck into them and then come out the other end with a collection that they know an enormous amount about. And in the meantime, there's been lots of community engagement, there's been lots of conversations, and it becomes more useful academically, institutionally, in terms of exhibitions and publishing. And there have been lots of really interesting crowdsourcing projects going on. They tend to be most of them tend to be transcription crowdsourcing projects, which are really nice, but I think we're particularly interested in crowdsourcing that you can't do on your own, that you have to talk to people about, or you have to research or get involved in some kind of discussion. That photo of my gran at the beginning, there's only 2 people alive now that know the story behind that, and therefore there has to be a mass to this kind of crowdsourcing. It's not something that just a few people can do in libraries or basements. It has to be a community conversation. So yeah, this is a piece of technological development, but it's also about how we pull in expertise from lots of environments that aren't digital. And when you go into community settings, then they've got one old PC that doesn't work and no internet connection, and it's not about this kind of tools. It's about how we funnel and channel the conversations into agreed metadata. The second part is project-based crowdsourcing. So this is probably, when we launched Historypin, we were very open about what the project, obviously within parameters, we were quite open about what the project would become and how the community would use it. And what's become obvious is that project-based or task-based or challenge-based use of Historypin is very popular and growing all the time. And what I mean by that is something that has particular kind of criteria for participation defined. So we are going to set out to tell the history of this particular campus over the last 100 years. And that's our parameters. and we're going to set up and run that project with particular communities. It's going to have a start. It's going to have an end. I mean, obviously, these projects don't often have an end because you can never uncover all the history of the campus. But you kind of design it in a way that gives it some focus and some purpose and some parameters. Or it could be, yeah, we're going to tell the history of this particular street corner or this person. Or when we have the metadata crowdsourcing tools, the challenge might be these are 10,000 images we know nothing about. Let's find out as much as we can about them over the next 6 months. We just did a really nice test with Brooklyn Museum. They had 500 pieces of content that they had no geolocation data for, and they put them out to their community and said, let's pin all of these pieces of content. And by the end of it, within about 3 weeks, they had all the location data for all of these pieces of content. So challenges and tasks is what will undoubtedly dominate Historypin within probably about 6 to 9 months. And when you come to Historypin, you will of course always find the big map through time, but actually you're more likely to find a world of small groups of people working on particular tasks, and those tasks aggregating and cross-pollinating in lots of interesting ways. So to walk through, I mean, and what's the idea of the next 12 months in New York is to work in partnership with a series of different partners as we develop the kind of open source tools on 5 or 6 projects, and that we get someone on the ground here that can support that, and we define them together and kind of support them and manage the activities together. So these challenges could have particular aims and targets. So this is the Fleischmann Bakery was on the corner of 11th and something else, Broadway maybe. A famous building with a really rich history to it that now is something completely different. An example of a challenge could be to find out as much as possible about this building. And what that immediately does, which is really nice, and we found again and again, is that it immediately makes that activity relevant to a particular community. So one of the projects we've done on a council estate in North London, which now doesn't exist, but it was these huge old buildings that were taken down. Thousands of people know somebody that lived in those buildings or has a story attached to those buildings. And a community of interest immediately develops around that particular project. So I think what's nice about the projects model, or these citizen history challenges as we call them, is that they bring together a particular group of people with a particular interest and ambition. So yeah, the theme and the subject is defined, the audience and the participants naturally define themselves, and then the activities and events do as well. So I'll talk a bit more about one project we've done in real depth, but essentially the community became filled with events and activities and meetups and hangouts of people trying to break down bits of the challenge in hand. So once this challenge has been established, then this is kind of talking about what's worked for us, but it won't necessarily define all projects. The role for champions has been particularly important. People who take this challenge up and promote it and further it and get really involved in it. A big role for obviously cultural and heritage institutions, sometimes one, but actually normally around any particular area or era or subject, there are a whole series of different archives that are going to be able to contribute in some way. So with the one I'll talk through more about, there were 9 heritage institutions and archives that contributed to it. Community groups, community organizations. Again, this is where you get the really nice intergenerational and community storytelling coming out around these challenges. And the interaction, I think traditionally, libraries, archives, museums, and may I say at universities, I'm not sure, are not fantastic at engaging their communities. But these kind of projects are a way to do that. If you're working together on the history of a particular area. So yeah, one of the projects, so within this Reading project, which I'll talk more about, Reading University got very heavily involved. Within the kind of East Palo Alto project we've been developing, Stanford have got heavily involved, and it's really good for the university and for the students to be collaborating on something rather than just kind of, I guess, investigating, sniffing around. So it's proved a really nice way of universities coming together with their communities and institutions as well. Schools within these projects play a very important role and have added lots and lots of activity and engagement to all of them. and universities, as I said, are becoming more and more important to all of our work. And the idea that, which we found really compelling, that there is obviously an interest in the content that gets gathered, or the stories that come out, or the things that we find out about collections or subjects. There's also an interest in the process itself, how you go from not knowing very much about something via thousands of people to knowing a lot about things is a fascinating process to examine in itself. So there is our role within this, which is design particular interfaces. This is an example of a challenge that we ran for the last couple of months. As you will have seen, we are all royal mad at the moment. And we did a challenge to invite people to pin the Queen's history over the last 60 years, and it was really lovely, the stuff that came in. Everyone gets their camera out when the Queen comes to visit. And we developed a particular interface for it to give it some distinctiveness and put lots of resource on it. Then lots and lots of activities and events. So having developed the challenge, having developed a network of people bought into that challenge, then getting it moving with lots and lots of activities, and the number of things you can do around challenges like this are kind of endless. And publishing. So once this content has been gathered, or while it's being gathered, for it to be published in different places is really important. This is an example of something we were doing with the San Francisco Metropolitan Transport Archive, where a lot of the content that got gathered through a project we were working on got overlaid onto bus shelters. So you can look through the bus shelter at the modern thing behind it. So that building, which you can't see very well, is behind the bus shelter. So it creates that overlay effect, which is really nice. And there's it can be books, it can be exhibitions, it can be projections. There's lots of ways of bringing this content back out once it's been gathered. And we're just scratching the surface of this. I think the possibilities for what communities can achieve when they come together around particular citizen history tasks, and then what they can take back out, is really exciting. And will go a lot of interesting places we're not expecting. So I will now, and then obviously out of all of that, we're particularly interested in defining and measuring a lot of the social outcomes. Working with institutions, they'll be particularly interested in the cultural heritage outcomes. Working with academic teams and universities, they'll be interested in some of the kind of research conclusions. But these ones are the kind of things that we measure within these projects. So to walk you through an example of one of these projects, Reading, which is very difficult not to pronounce Reading if you're American, but Reading is a town just outside London which we picked for our pilot project at the end of last year, partly because it's regarded as quite a boring place, but actually where you kind of change train, but actually when you scratch the surface, it's got a very rich history to it. And it was famous for the 3 Bs, which was beer, biscuits and bulbs. And while we were running this project, actually, the final B closed down. So the final brewery closed down and was replaced by Reading's 12th Tesco supermarket. So, and that in itself became a fascinating story. And kind of allow people to engage with the history in different ways. So to walk you through this project, we spent around kind of 4 or 5 months preparing, and then we had a 3-month public engagement phase. During that public engagement phase, we aimed to create a communal archive of 200 years of Reading's history. This was quite a big challenge, actually, and we found that it broke itself down into lots of much smaller challenges, as we'll talk a bit more about. We involved 32 community groups and organizations. 35 schools took part, all the schools pretty much. It was about 80 volunteers and champions played a particularly important role during this time. Just under 2,000 people contributed within 3 months. Reading Museum, as part of it, ran an exhibition to which 17,000 people came to, and it proved so popular that they've ended up committing a kind of permanent space to it, because obviously this activity doesn't stop at the end of a delivery period. It continues and evolves and perpetuates. And during the 3 months, around 125,000 people came and visited the content online. And then from all of that, during those 3 months, around just over 4,000 pieces of content were gathered. And then since the project ended in December, around another 3,000 have continued to be added. So what's so exciting for us is that this activity stuck within the community and continued and grew. And then measuring all of this really closely as we did, we always get external evaluators to come and look at the impact of our work. The effect on learning more about local heritage was one area we wanted to examine, came out really strongly. I think if this hadn't come out strongly, we would have been surprised, because this, obviously the project was about local heritage, but the diversity of appeal of local heritage, which was really impressive. Effect on people's sense of community. 60% feeling close to their community result of participating was really strong. We were really pleased with that. And people just, that kind of shared sense of place that people are often missing when they move in and out of communities quickly, or when they just don't develop a relationship with their neighbours. That sense of place was something we wanted to measure closely and came out strongly. Interesting, the regularity. So in that quote on the bottom left-hand corner, coming here every Friday and interacting with a broader range of people has been useful, learning a bit more about different types of software. So that first point, coming here every Friday, the regularity of it was really important. And ultimately, we kind of, yes, project by project, but we want it to become a permanent activity. Yeah, the kind of role of regularity within community activities came out really strongly. Effects on relationships, intergenerational relationships, this was really strong, and we've seen this in all the projects we've run, that it's just a natural force. We never talk about it as an intergenerational project. We never say, dear young person, dear old person, please come and talk about history. We just put on activities that are appealing to both groups, and out of it comes, quite often, I mean, and it isn't set like this, but quite often the younger people are playing the role of kind of digital activists and doing a lot of the digitization and pinning. And the older people become the kind of gatekeepers to local memory and are very valued within that role. And the two combine into a really nice set of social outcomes. And then finally, probably our most important stat, about 40% of participants became more involved in activities in their communities since taking part in the project, which was higher than we were expecting. So people having come to a few, community archiving projects, then went out via those connections and that community confidence and became involved in a lot more in their community, which we were really pleased about. So this is an example of a project that was quite well funded and it was very heavily evaluated, but our aim is now to run, in New York in particular, to run a whole series of these projects, and while we're doing it, to develop the tools that allow anybody to set them up on the site. At the moment, we set up projects and challenges, and we manage them and curate them and work with partners to do that. But by the early next year, the idea is that anybody can come and set up and run a project of their own choosing. And so one of the aims of obviously this visit and this particular talk is to tell you more about Historypin and how to contribute and how to get collections on there. And one of it is to get people thinking about how we might work together on particular projects. A project, probably at its best when there is something like a university campus is actually quite a good example, or a particular neighbourhood, because there's often quite a lot of archival collections connected to it. There's a lot of people who have got a kind of a buy into those memories and a part of those memories. So we, just to give you an example of one that we've already gathered here, there is a kind of budding Queens memory project. Queens, which I hadn't been to before, which is as diverse a place as I'd ever visited. And amazing that kind of we've been looking at how the tools can reflect different layers of migration and the impact of that migration on kind of local culture. And Queens seems to kind of replace its communities very, very quickly. So that map would look fascinating. But yeah, so that's an example of one, and I think the aim really is to accumulate a series of really good ideas and good partners, and then get back here, get some resource on the ground, and start working on things. So yeah, thank you.